We've seen so far the change or shift in thinking that was brought about by the pre-Socratics, and that shift away from the sort of thinking about the universe, about the world around us, that we find in the Metamorphoses. But they're called pre-Socratics mainly to differentiate them from Socrates, even though some happened to live at the time of Socrates. They looked for natural explanations for natural phenomena in the world. They didn't want to constantly be appealing to the gods to explain the movement of the sun or things of that sort. So they were worried about the fundamental structure of the physical world. What differentiates Socrates is that he might have said, that's a great question and a great line of investigation, but we're leaving out something, which is, what is the good life for a human being? What ought we to be striving for? What's right? What's wrong? What is just? Now, Socrates lived from 469 to 399 BC, and he was killed for being a philosopher. He stood trial for corrupting the youth of Athens through his philosophy and was sentenced to death. Now, you would think, since Socrates is widely regarded as one of the founders of Western philosophy, that we would have a lot of his writings, and from which we could acquire a deposit of wisdom. But strangely enough, as far as we know, he didn't write anything. And we have very few sources that tell us about Socrates. But one of the main sources is Plato. As I said before, Plato was the student of Socrates. And Plato mostly wrote in dialogue form. And usually in that dialogue, one of the main characters was Socrates. But that creates a problem because you don't know if the character of Socrates is speaking for Plato or is supposed to be speaking for Socrates himself. And what scholars hypothesize is that the Platonic dialogues, Plato's dialogues, can be divided up into the early, middle, and later dialogues. What's characteristic of the early dialogues is that the character of Socrates is mainly a counterpuncher. He spends a lot of time asking questions without putting forward any positive views of his own. He focuses on asking the most basic or fundamental questions. So scholars think that in those dialogues, the character of Socrates really represents Socrates himself. And the Euthyphro, which we're looking at presently, is one of those early dialogues. There's no resolution at the end. Socrates doesn't really put forward any views of his own. Rather, he's a counterpuncher to what Euthyphro has to say. So why did Socrates ask so many questions? Was he just curious by nature? Because you could ask questions for a lot of reasons. You could do it to annoy someone, or distract them, or make them tired, get them to remember something, or even embarrass them. And though I'm emphasizing that Socrates asked questions, we don't want to just point out he asked questions, because some people think, well, that's what Socrates did well, he asked questions. No, he asked a certain kind of question. Because he was suspicious that people did not know what they really claimed to know, especially about the most important matters of human existence. He was suspicious that even if they were right about what they were saying, they didn't know they were right. And that's the reason why he asked the questions that he did. He'd come across someone who was supremely confident in their views of whether a war was just, and then he'd start asking those basic questions and find that they didn't know how to answer them, which made it somewhat ridiculous that they were so confident about their views of the war. So Socrates placed an emphasis on the most basic, the most fundamental, the most crucial questions. What he realized was that knowledge has a structure. Everything you know is related to everything else you know in some way, like a building. There are items of knowledge that you have that belong in the foundation of the building, and then there are other items that occupy the higher floors of the building. Now, just like with the building, the things that you supposedly know that go in the foundations better be pretty secure, or all the supposed knowledge that you have built up from them is going to collapse. So think of it this way. Suppose someone asked you, what is the meaning of life? And you gave them the Westminster Shorter Catechism answer. You said, our chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. But then they said, okay, I buy that if God exists, but how do you know that God exists? And at that point, you have no clue what to say. Your knowing that our chief end is to glorify God depends on your prior knowledge that God exists. And if you don't know that, it seems like you don't have knowledge of what our chief end is. Or imagine that you're pro-life and someone asks you to give your reasons for being pro-life, and you say, well, the pro-life view is taught in the Bible. And the person says, okay, but how do you know the Bible is true? And you say, God wrote it. And then they say, well, how do you know God wrote it? And at that point, you're stupefied. You have nothing to say. That is going to create a lot of uncertainty higher up in your pro-life view, because that pro-life view is built up from your knowledge that the Bible is the Word of God. So that is one of the insights that Socrates and Plato stumbled upon, that knowledge has a structure, that thinking will has a structure, that truth has a structure. So what is this more basic, most fundamental question that Socrates and Plato managed to latch onto? Well, you're going to be unimpressed at first when I tell you what that question is, but we'll have to cash it out so you'll see why it's important. It's basically what I call the what is it question, where you're trying to make sense of what a thing is, why it belongs to one kind as opposed to another. And this is something you actually do think is important, because whenever you acquire an expertise in something, like an expertise in computer science, there are certain definitions that you've got to master. You're not going to be an expert in computer science if you don't know what the word RAM means, or you're not going to be an expert at nursing if you don't know what the word stat means. But the same is true of life and the vocation of life. We're trying to acquire the expertise of living well, and that means knowing the definitions of some of the most fundamental and important characteristics that apply to our lives, like truth, justice, beauty, and goodness. So when we're looking for the definition of something, what we're trying to specify or get at is the nature of that thing, its essential characteristics that it can't lose without ceasing to be that kind of thing. Even though I'm using the word definition, you might think, well, what you're talking about is the definition of words, but we're not interested in the definition of words. We're not doing lexicography. If that were the case, we could solve all of our problems just by looking up terms in a dictionary. No, the point of words is to point us to things in the world, and what we're more interested in is the things, not the words themselves. So a definition gets at the essence or the nature of something. And this is something you're familiar with in science, because that's what science does about all sorts of physical objects in the world. We're told that water is H2O, or that a pine tree is different from other kinds of trees, and they have a definition for a pine tree, or they have a definition for what makes something a star. Well, that works great for objects in the physical world, but not all the objects that we care about are physical. Some of them are more abstract. They're philosophical objects, like justice and truth, and right and wrong.